Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Today, we are talking about taxation without representation. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, and the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. Continuing on with Unit 3. So, if you are ready, let's begin. First thing we need to talk about is a little recap of how England tried to assert their authority over the colonies. So, if you remember, for context, we had something called the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. And the major impact of that was that Britain was in debt. While Britain won the war, they beat France. Britain owed a lot of money. And so, another issue here is that Britain wanted to limit the colonial expansion. So, a lot of the colonists after the 7 Years' War wanted to continue pushing west, but Britain was afraid of conflict with Native Americans, and so they issued that line called the Proclamation of 1763, which essentially stated that that colonists could not move west past that line, and a lot of colonists did anyway. That caused some tension. So the result of Britain being in debt and this proclamation of 763, but mostly the result of the 7 Years' War, is that Britain is going to start to tax the colonies because they realize that they need to get some more money, and they think the colonies should pay for it since the war was fought in the New World. So, what are the main taxes that Britain is going to do on the colonies? Now, there's a ton of them, but these are a couple that are important to know. The first one is the Stamp Act. This is in 1765. This is a tax on a bunch of different things, commonly used goods like newspapers and playing cards, anything made from paper, and essentially you'd have to put like a stamp. You'd have to pay for a stamp that would go onto the item, which is what you see. That's that picture. It's the stamp. Okay. So after the Stamp Act, the colonists are going to be upset and they're going to respond with something called the Stamp Act Congress. And this is essentially where they boycott the Stamp Act, meaning they refuse to pay the taxes. They do things like tar and feather tax collectors. That's when they would take tax collectors. And if you can imagine, like remember Home Alone, where they literally put tar and feather onto the people trying to collect the taxes. It was a painful experience. It's like hot tar on these people trying to collect the taxes. So Britain actually takes a step back after this, and they decide to repeal the Stamp Act because they see it's causing too many issues. However, a couple of years later, we see something called the Townshend Acts in 1767, and this is taxes on tea and lead, glass, and paint. And then again, we see more colonial boycotts because they saw that it worked in the Stamp Act, so they're going to boycott the Townshend Acts again. So the colonies boycott, and everything except for that tax on the tea was overturned. Well, then we see a little bit later some further taxes and then some issues that are going to come from it. And this is kind of a chain reaction. So there's something called the Tea Act in 1773. And this is when Britain is trying to bail out the British East India Company because here's the deal is that even though the Britain is selling tea to the colonists, and even though the tea that Britain is selling is cheaper than other tea that they could get, the colonists are going to oppose buying the tea because they don't feel that they should be taxed without having representation in Parliament. Because here's the issue. The colonists are paying all these taxes to Britain, but they don't have any seats in Parliament over in Britain. And so they don't have any say in the government. And so they're frustrated. So when we have the Tea Act, which is like a further, increase in taxes on our tea, the colonists are going to get upset. They're going to resist it, and they're going to respond with something called, which I'm sure you've heard of before, the Boston Tea Party. That's what's pictured here in the bottom left. Boston Tea Party, 1773, is where a group of patriots called the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, and they threw a ton of tea into the Boston Harbor. The amount of tea that they threw in is a shocking amount, millions and millions of dollars in today's money worth of tea that they threw into the Boston Harbor. a huge financial blow for Britain. And the reason that the Sons of Liberty, just so you know, a little background on them, they're like a patriot group who is trying to, again, protest a lot of these taxes and what they see as unjust. And so they kind of get together to do this. They planned this out. So after the Boston Tea Party, Britain is going to respond with something called the Coercive Acts. And you might also hear them called the Intolerable Acts. And this is basically a punishment to Boston for the Tea Party. So they close down the port of Boston until Boston agrees to pay back all the damages, which is essentially not possible. And there's some other punishments that go along with this, but the main one is that they close down the port of Boston. Well, the colonists are not going to appreciate that. And so the coercive acts inspire the colonists to create something called the First Continental Congress in 1774. And this is essentially a meeting of patriots who are trying to figure out how to deal with Britain. They want to go back to salutary neglect. Now, think, what's salutary neglect? All right, it's when the Britain had previously agreed to leave the colonies alone as long as they were making money for Britain. So they're trying to figure out how to convince Britain to go back to that idea of salutary neglect. And I do want everyone to know that at this time, the vast majority of people in the Continental Congress are not calling for independence. That is too far off. They still see themselves as British. They're just trying to figure out a way to get what they want out of this arrangement. All right, moving on. So, how do the colonies and the colonists justify their resistance to the British? Because we see all these boycotts and we see what they're doing and they're meeting. And while they're not talking about revolution quite yet, they are upset with their stance in the British Empire. And so, what's their justification? This stuff is really important because it's going to be philosophical. So, first of all, they see themselves that they should have more rights because they are British, right? Britain has this idea of something called virtual representation, which is that Parliament is supposedly acting in the best interest of all of their subjects, even if those people don't have representation. And the colonists in the Americas are not going to think that that's a good idea. They want to have seats in Congress, in Parliament, themselves. So they're going to reject this idea that they're being represented. Another justification is the colonists are going to believe in the rights of the individual. For example, they're disagreeing with taxation, and then there were these things called writs of assistance that Britain was using, where they had search warrants that were basically open-ended. They could search any ship that the colonists had because they're trying to reduce the smuggling. If you remember the Navigation Acts, the colonists were only allowed to trade with England. So a lot of colonists are trying to smuggle and trade with other countries, and they're getting all their ships searched, by the British Navy. Colonists are upset with that. So they don't feel like they have rights as an individual people. The colonists also have a long history of self-rule. Remember that the colonies in the Americas could elect their own legislatures. If you think back to Virginia's House of Burgesses, right? That was one of our first representative forms of government. Britain the colonists did not see themselves as needing British representatives. They saw that they should have their own representatives. Again, they think they should have rule over themselves. And then the last idea for their justification of why they're resisting the British is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a trend that's going on in Europe and the Americas where basically people are having a philosophical revolution in what it means to be a person inside of a government or a group of people inside of a government. And there's this person named John Locke, who's very important to know. And he has something he calls the consent of the governed, which is essentially how he thinks governments should treat people. And then, one of our main phrases from here is life, liberty, and property, which is the idea that everybody should have a right to that. And the colonists are feeling like those rights are being violated. Okay. So as we get more and more into this independence movement and people start to become more willing to actively resist the British and push for independence, we got to understand who's taking part of that. So there are a ton of colonial leaders to talk about. I'm only gonna focus in on one, but we'll talk about others in class. So one I want to bring up is Ben Franklin. Now, Ben Franklin is an important colonial leader. He's going to argue that America has a lot to do with the fact that the Britain won the 7 Years' War. So he's going to say, look, I know that Britain is saying that the colonies need to pay back some of this debt, but the colonies helped you win that war. Remember, we were fighting in that war ourselves. We housed some of your soldiers. Ben Franklin also helped co-write the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson, who gets most of the credit for that. And in the Revolutionary War, which we'll get to, Ben Franklin is going to help get France to support us, which is a huge reason that America is successful. So Ben Franklin is one important colonial leader. We'll talk about others in future notes. There's also some popular movements, some groups of people and individuals that work together to try to get the independent movement going. We have groups called the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And these are two separate groups for men and women who are essentially trying to figure out ways that they can inspire people to be on the side of independence. They do things like they boycott British goods, and they have another idea called the homespun movement, where essentially they want to buy everything that's made in the colonies. They refuse to buy things that are made in Britain. There's also, just so we understand this term patriots, the patriots are people who are loyal to the independence movement. Loyalists would be people who are loyal to Britain. And at this time, before the Revolutionary War starts, we're still under, and about 50% of people in the colonies were in favor of independence. It's not as overwhelming as maybe you might think. And we have an individual, lastly, named Mercy Otis Warren, a writer that urged independence and tried to get out more ideas on independence. So these are some groups of people who took part in the independence movement. And now let's keep talking about more. How did they do this a little bit more specifically, right? How did men and women support the patriot movement? Well, we talked about this previously, but women were making a lot of cloth themselves. So that was the idea that people would buy the colonist cloth instead of buying the cloth made in Britain. Women would, as we get into the war, which I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but as we get into the war, women would join the army as things called camp followers, where they're not fighting, but they're helping out. They're cooking, they're cleaning, they're being nurses. And there's this folklore of this individual named Molly Pitcher, who is someone pictured in the bottom left. Probably not a real story, probably like a combination of a lot of different people who actually helped fight in the battle, and would carry pitchers of water from battle to battle and to help out the soldiers. Okay. Another way women supported the patriot movement was that women would help run the farms and the businesses while men were away, because the men were fighting. How did men help? A lot of them joined the army, which is called the Continental Army, and they joined state militias to try to support the patriot movement. A lot of the colonists started to agree that they needed to pay taxes to the patriot government, the state governments, and then slowly the national government. And then they're also going to, again, support these boycotts of British goods. And a lot of people are going to donate supplies to the army to help the army, because the army in the colonist army, the Continental Army, does struggle with enough funding because the federal government does not have enough power to tax as they wanted to when we get into that, which we'll talk about that more in some future lessons. Other ideas here that go along with the revolution and the philosophical foundations of it is this concept of American individualism. And if you think about what it is to be an American compared to other countries, even to this day, you often think about Americans believe in being an individual person, how important it is to be your own person. Okay, and the freedom that you have. That's things that are instilled in Americans. So where does this come from? Well, one person it comes from is John Locke. We've talked about him already, an Enlightenment thinker. His teachings basically go over that human beings are essentially good people. And again, it is important that the government allows people to have life, liberty, and property. And we'll see these ideas get put into our Declaration of Independence and into our government. Okay. For example, another idea here, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, and we'll talk more about the founding of the Constitution, but the Constitution bans noble titles, right? One of the big parts of the Constitution that we wanted to make clear was that our government in America was not going to have a monarchy. It was not going to have a king or dukes or nobles of any kind. And the last idea here of American individualism is John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill, which is a speech that John Winthrop writes that emphasized American exceptionalism, right? So that it's the fact that America is a special, unique place, and that America stands out above the rest. And then again, go back to the foundations of the American colonies, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Quakers, a ton of other people, they all came to America to pursue this idea of religious freedom as individuals. So all of these idea helps create the American culture, the American idea of what it means to be an individual and why we are often many people disagreeing with British authority. Another idea we need to get in here, a very important Enlightenment thinker, is this individual Thomas Paine. I like to call him T-Pain. I like that picture in the bottom left. Anyway, so T-Pain, he's an author. He's actually born in England, and he writes a book text called Common Sense. And this is a super important text to know. Highlight it, bookmark it, double star, whatever you got to do. Common Sense. It's one of the most influential writings in American history. Common Sense essentially challenges King George III, who is the King of England at the time. And in Common Sense, he urges people to break away from a corrupt monarch. He has quotes things like, "A little island cannot rule a larger continent." And it's, again, one of these philosophical foundations for the American Revolution. It's one of our founding ideals. And it's going to be used to challenge King George. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is going to help inspire one of our most important documents, the Declaration of Independence, which is inspired by all manner of Enlightenment ideas. One of the founding ideas here is that all men have natural rights. And in the Declaration of Independence, they're going to use the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, borrowing from John Locke's life, liberty, and property. Property doesn't sound as good as pursuit of happiness. This is when Declaration of Independence is essentially a breakup letter that America writes to England, and it's a list of all the grievances that we have with England. And it's when we formally break away from England. And it's actually issued 1 year after the fighting for the American Revolutionary War begins at Lexington and Concord. So America's already fighting with Britain for a year before we really commit to saying, look, the Americans need to issue a formal document to England stating what we believe and what we want to have happen. So that was a lot, I know. Those were all of the ideas on taxation without representation and the philosophical foundations for the American Revolution. It's important, especially when we have a lot of new content that we're learning, to keep track of what was most important. So here are my big idea questions for you. Please jot these down and we'll go over them. What caused the colonists to complain? What are they frustrated about at the beginning of all of this? Number 2, what philosophical ideas are going to encourage independence? And we talked about a bunch of them. Make sure you're able to name people and their specific ideas. And third, what are the root causes of the independence movement, which hopefully you can see some of number 3 in number 1 and number 2. So thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you all. I will see you next time.